Arthur Wren spent 60 years building something that could not be touched. He started with land no one wanted and turned it into an empire. He tripled the family fortune once, then tripled it again. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and the room adjusted to him. Not because he demanded it, but because 60 years of being right about everything tends to produce that effect. He had one blind spot, one place where his judgment, which had never failed him across 4 decades of deals and decisions and negotiations, went completely dark. His son. On a Tuesday morning in November, Daniel Wren placed a document on his father's desk. It was legal, precise, and had been prepared with care by people Arthur had never met. By the end of that week, the empire Arthur had spent his life building belonged to someone else. That someone was the boy he had brought to meetings at 12 years old, the child he had educated in every room of the business, every negotiation, every deal. The person whose name Arthur had spoken when he signed the papers that made it all possible. Arthur Wren never saw it coming, not a flicker, not a warning, nothing. This is the story of what he missed, and why the one thing a man cannot pass down to his son is the very thing that made him worth inheriting from. The Wren family fortune had been built in the early part of the last century by Arthur's grandfather, a man of very little formal education and an almost preternatural ability to understand what a piece of land would be worth in 20 years. He had bought and held and bought again, moving through the Northeast like a quiet tide, acquiring properties that everyone else considered marginal and watching them become essential. By the time he died, he had left behind a portfolio that was not spectacular by the standards of the very rich, but was substantial, stable, and entirely debt-free. Arthur's father had done less with it, which is the fate of second generations in dynasties that were built by one extraordinary person and inherited by someone merely competent. He had maintained what was given to him, which was not nothing, but it was not growth. The fortune had held its shape for 30 years under his stewardship. It was waiting, though no one knew it, for Arthur. Arthur Wren was 27 when he took over the family holdings, and he was not merely competent. He had the same quality his grandfather had, that quiet, almost eerie ability to see forward in time through land and buildings and demographics. He saw where people were going before they went there, and he owned what they would need when they arrived. By 45, he had tripled the family's holdings. By 55, he had tripled them again. The Wren name, which had been respected but unremarkable in the world of old money, became something closer to legendary. He built it all with one purpose, one destination toward which every acquisition, every negotiation, every carefully structured deal was aimed. His son, Daniel, the third generation that would finally fulfill the promise the first had made and the second had merely preserved. Daniel Wren was born when Arthur was 32, and from the beginning Arthur saw in the boy everything he had hoped to see. Intelligence that was clear from the first years, a particular sharpness in how the child watched and listened, an ease in rooms full of important people that seemed inherited rather than learned. Arthur brought Daniel to meetings when the boy was 12. He explained deals at the dinner table. He gave the child access to information that most adults in his circle would never see, because he believed, absolutely, without doubt, that exposure was education, and that the best education for an heir was the enterprise itself. What Arthur saw as investment, Daniel experienced as pressure. This is one of the oldest failures of love between fathers and sons. The certainty of the giver that what they are offering is a gift, and the knowledge of the receiver that it is also a weight. Daniel had not chosen the Wren legacy, yet he had been born into it, and there is a significant difference between building something and inheriting something, which is that the builder remembers what it was before, and the inheritor only knows what it is. Daniel had never known anything except the expectation. He did not resent his father, Or if he did not know it. He had grown up so close to Arthur's certainty that he had internalized it, worn it like a coat that had been handed to him before he was old enough to choose his own. He was, by every visible measure, exactly what Arthur had shaped him to be. Attentive, capable, devoted to the family name. At 25, he joined the firm formally, and within 3 years, he was managing a significant portion of the portfolio with a skill that confirmed everything Arthur had believed. The trouble, when it came, did not announce itself. It arrived the way all the most dangerous things arrive, dressed as something else. Her name was Claudia Marsh, and she came from money in the way that some people come from money. Not inherited, but adjacent. Her family had been near wealth for 2 generations without ever quite having it, which had given her something more useful than a trust fund. It had given her an education in how the very rich thought about themselves and what they needed and what they feared. She met Daniel at a property acquisition dinner in the spring of his 28th year. She was 31, composed in the particular way of someone who had never not been the most interesting person in a room and had learned to wear it without appearing to notice it. She knew exactly what the Wren name meant. She had known for years. And Arthur met her twice before the engagement was announced and found nothing to concern him. She was intelligent, well-mannered, and had the right instincts in conversation. She listened more than she spoke, remembered what she heard, and knew enough about property and capital to follow the discussions that filled every Wren family gathering. Arthur approved of her, more than approved. He was relieved. He had worried privately that Daniel would choose someone who did not understand the world they occupied. Claudia understood it perfectly. She understood it far better than Arthur knew. The restructuring proposal arrived on Arthur's desk on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 years into Daniel and Claudia's marriage. It had been prepared by a law firm Arthur did not recognize, which should have been the first signal, and it was presented by Daniel with a composure that Arthur would later understand had been practiced for longer than the document suggested. The proposal recommended a comprehensive restructuring of the Wren family holdings, a transition of operational control to a newly formed management entity, with Daniel as its sole director, and Arthur moving to a senior advisory role with no voting rights over acquisition or disposal decisions. The stated rationale was modernization. The language was careful and thorough and entirely reasonable in its presentation of the family's need to prepare for the next generation of leadership. Arthur read it twice. He set it down. He looked at his son across the desk of the office he had occupied for 30 years. He asked one question: whether Daniel had written it himself. As Daniel said, they had worked on it together, himself and Claudia and the legal team. The hesitation before that word, they, was almost imperceptible. Arthur noticed it the way he noticed everything, clearly, precisely, and one moment too late. He did not sign the proposal. He asked for time to review it with his own counsel. Daniel agreed, with the particular ease of someone who has already accounted for this step in their planning. Arthur's lawyers reviewed the document over the following 2 weeks and reported that while the restructuring was aggressive, it was not beyond Daniel's rights as a 51% shareholder in the family management company, a position Arthur himself had structured 15 years ago in a piece of estate planning designed to demonstrate confidence in his son's eventual leadership. Arthur had given Daniel the mechanism. Daniel had simply chosen the moment to use it. What followed was not a legal battle. Arthur was too proud for a legal battle and too old for one, and understood, with the same clarity he had always brought to the analysis of difficult situations, that a legal battle over control of a family dynasty fought between a father and his son in public court would leave nothing worth controlling by the time it ended. He did not sign the restructuring proposal. He did not need to. Daniel's lawyers wrote to Arthur's lawyers in January to advise that the transition of operational control had been effected under the existing shareholder agreement and did not require Arthur's signature. As the firm that Arthur had spent 30 years building, that his grandfather had begun and his father had held, and he had transformed into something that bore the Wren name with genuine gravity, was no longer his to run. He remained a shareholder. He remained, on paper, a senior figure. His name was still on the letterhead. His office was still available to him. But the decisions were no longer his. The calls were no longer to him. The people who had worked for him for decades now worked for Daniel, and they understood, with the sensitivity that professional people develop around power, that the old order had been replaced by the new one. Arthur continued to come to the office for 3 months after the transition. Then he stopped. He was 71 years old, and he had a house in Connecticut that he had bought decades ago and almost never occupied. He had a garden that had been maintained by a service for years and that he had never personally tended. He had money. His personal holdings, separate from the firm, were substantial. And he had time, which is the one thing that men who have spent their lives in work discover at the end of it is not, after all, a gift. He did not speak to Daniel for 8 months, not out of anger, or not only out of anger, but because he could not find the words for what he wanted to say, and he was a man who did not speak without knowing what he meant. He had nothing to negotiate. There was nothing to recover. He sat with the silence of a man who has understood something so large and so late that the understanding itself is its own kind of grief. His wife, St. Eleanor, who had been beside him for 46 years and who had watched the whole of it from a particular proximity, said to him once that Daniel had always been more afraid of him than he knew. Arthur listened to this and turned it over for a long time. He did not know what to do with it, but he kept it. The call came in the spring of the following year. Daniel's voice had the particular quality of someone who has prepared for a conversation and found, when it arrived, that the preparation was not enough. He asked to meet. Arthur agreed. They met in the Connecticut house, in the garden that Arthur had recently begun tending himself, not because he had forgiven his son or arrived at peace with what had happened, but because the garden needed tending, and the work of it was the closest thing to clarity he had found. And Daniel sat across from him at a garden table and was, for the first time in Arthur's memory, entirely without the composure that had always defined him. He looked like what he was, a man who had done something he could not undo and had begun, too late, to understand its full weight. They spoke for 2 hours. Arthur asked, and Daniel answered, with the particular honesty of someone who has nothing left to protect. Some of what was said was what Arthur expected. Some was not. The role Claudia had played was larger than Daniel entirely acknowledged, and smaller than Arthur had imagined. The resentment that had accumulated over decades was real and had been used, by someone who understood it better than Daniel himself, as a lever. Daniel had not been the architect of what happened. He had been its instrument. This was not an excuse, but it was the truth. Arthur walked Daniel to the gate when it was over. He did not embrace his son. He said only that the Wren name had been built by people who understood that a dynasty is not land or capital or even a firm. It is a set of values that outlasts the people who hold it. Whatever Daniel did with what he had taken, he should remember that. Arthur watched him drive away. Then he went back to the garden. Arthur Wren did not rebuild what was taken from him. He was 71 years old, and he was not a man who repeated himself. He had built one thing in his life and built it completely, and it had been taken by the person he had built it for, which was a conclusion so perfectly circular that it sometimes seemed, in his more sardonic moments, almost elegant. He lived for 9 more years in the Connecticut house, and he tended his garden with the same precision he had once applied to acquisitions. He read. He corresponded in letters written by hand with a small number of people whose company he valued. He was not unhappy, which surprised him. He had expected the absence of the work to feel like an absence of himself. It did not. He discovered, at 71, that there was more of him than the work had occupied. When he died, at 80, the estate he left was his own, his personal holdings, untouched by the restructuring, quietly managed for a decade and left to a charitable foundation that bore his grandfather's name. Daniel received nothing from the estate. This was not an act of cruelty. Arthur had written a letter, delivered by the lawyers with the will, as explaining that Daniel had already received his inheritance, that he had taken it at a time of his own choosing, and that Arthur hoped he had used it well. The Wren family firm, under Daniel's management, performed adequately. Not poorly, not brilliantly, adequately, which is perhaps the most honest verdict on what is lost when someone takes a thing they did not build and attempts to run it without the understanding that built it. The name persisted. The capital persisted. What did not persist was the particular quality that Arthur had brought to it, the ability to see 20 years forward, to know what a piece of ground would be worth before the world had decided, because that was not transferable. It had died in a garden in Connecticut, in the hands of a man who spent his last years growing things that would outlast him. The lesson of Arthur Wren is not that fathers should trust their sons less. It is not that dynasties are fragile, or that inheritance corrupts, or that love makes men blind. All of these things are true, but none of them is the lesson. The lesson is this: Arthur gave Daniel everything: the knowledge, the access, the power, the name, and finally the legal mechanism that made the transfer possible. He gave it all freely and with complete love, and in doing so, he forgot the one thing that cannot be given, the thing that made the empire worth having, the hunger that builds things from nothing, that sees forward when everyone else is looking at what is in front of them, that wakes before dawn not because it has to, but because it cannot imagine not doing so, that cannot be inherited, it can only be earned. And it is earned the only way it has ever been earned, by having nothing and wanting something and building it with your own hands from the ground up. Daniel had never had nothing. His father had made sure of it, out of love, and in making sure of it, had ensured that his son would never have the one thing that mattered most. The fire that built the empire could not be passed down. It could only be inherited as ash. And ash, however carefully preserved, however beautifully displayed, is not fire. It is only what fire leaves behind. Arthur Wren knew this at the end. He had known it the moment he looked across his desk at his son's practiced composure and understood that something had been prepared for him. He had spent 60 years building something from nothing, and in a single morning he learned the price of making that nothing too easy for the person who came after. He paid it without complaint. He went to his garden, and he grew things.